Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Irish Gerontological Society CSRD NUI Galway seminar today on family carers. I think this is the fourth seminar we've had with NUI Galway in collaboration with the IGS, and so it's been a really interesting and exciting collaboration. So hopefully today we're discussing a really important issue, and that issue is family carers. And I've got a really distinguished group of people who are going to discuss this with me. I've got Suzanne Cahill, I've got Anya Tehan, and I've got Manuel Ruiz-Adame from the University of Granada. I'll introduce them as they come along, but we're going to spend about just under 90 minutes with 4 presentations and a discussion at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to get right into it. I'm chairing the session, but I want to just start off. I want to start off with a brief overview, which hopefully will set the scene for what follows. And the focus is on, as I said, family carers and people with dementia, and bringing family carers into discussion. We had a previous webinar on people with dementia, and we just thought it might be a really useful thing to look at care. So if I share my screen now, and I'll put this on slideshow. So I hope everybody can see that. So I'm just going to give a few brief slides on dementia and caregiving in Ireland. The CSRD here in Galway have been sort of looking at carers along with people with dementia for the last number of years, and it's a really important part of our remit in sort of thinking about thinking about research in this area. So in terms of the issue of caring, I guess we wouldn't be talking about caring if we weren't talking about people with dementia in this context. And it's always useful to go back to first base to think about the numbers here, because the numbers are quite staggering, and I sometimes feel that in policy discussion that we miss a focus on the numbers. Worldwide, of course, numbers are huge, 75 million people over the next 10 years. Also the cost, just under $1 trillion in 2015. And the really interesting part about dementia and working on dementia, I think, is that, unlike a lot of sort of healthcare, clinical areas, less than 20% of these costs are attributed to direct medical care. And conversely, informal care basically account for between 40 and 60% worldwide. It's very difficult to estimate these relationships, but that's why you've got a band there between 40 and 60%. But I think one of the things is that the share of caring is essentially disproportionately shared or shaped towards informal care. And of course, one of the things about dementia in particular is that caring is associated with long care hours and physically demanding caregiving. In Ireland, the numbers are equally interesting. The estimate that people use right now are 55,000 people with dementia. Our recent estimates suggested probably this is closer to 65 now. But you can see the numbers increasing in line with demographic aging, up to 152,000 in 2046. And again, costs of caring, which are estimated by looking at the financial cost of informal care or family care, about 40,500 per person, or just under 2 billion. So these are non-trivial numbers, and family care accounts for almost half of these costs. The demography are interesting because obviously population aging has implications for dementia. The big success in Irish society over the last number of years has been the fact that older people are living longer from birth, but also from age 65. Now 19 years, up from 12 and a half years in 1986. For females, now nearly 22 years, up from 16 years again in 1986. So people are living longer, but with that comes the potential for dementia. Another aspect of dementia, another aspect of demography is the caretaker potential, which is sometimes used in the literature to describe sort of the normal profile of carers, which, as we've seen in the next slide, is mainly women, and mainly, you know, in between 20 and 59. And it's like also likely over the next years, as the number of people with dementia increases to 150,000 by 2051, so also will the numbers of potential carers. Now, this is not a normative position. These are simply reflecting actual care at the moment. The numbers in that age category, particularly in women, will likely fall, but it'll also fall for another reason, and that's because of female workforce participation. So when we think about caring in the future, we shouldn't really think about it as if that future won't change. The present numbers are likely to be impacted proportionately. So that's something really an important message to take at this early stage. The caring realities, I think we don't need to spell it out that much, but you know, home care supports are weak in Ireland, but you know, there has been changes over the last number of years which have designed to increase supports from the National Dementia Office through the National Dementia Strategy, and over the next few years through new home care legislation. But the reality is that community care is still very dependent on family care. Another interesting point, which doesn't get really much talked about, but even though we all realize the importance of family care, individually, privately, in our own domestic lives, in our own communities, it's very rarely talked about in public discussion. It's largely absent in terms of, is this what society wants? Is this culturally part of how we think about care? Should carers be rewarded financially more? How do we think about legislation to support rights and so on? It's also complicated, of course, by the Irish welfare state, which is a complicated welfare state. You know, a combination of an old Anglo-Saxon model, a combination of sort of conservative social insurance model, combination of a sort of kind of partly universal, partly means tested. So it's a complicated system. There's parts of the southern welfare states as well, which is why Manuel being here today is interesting in its reliance on families. But we'll say more about that at the end. So this is the context, I think, that you need to think about as well. Who cares? Well, most people with dementia live at home, so the vast majority are cared by family and friends. Our estimates and others suggest that around 60,000 family carers of people with dementia. You know, some people with dementia have more than one care. Some have a principal care only. Some people are doing more hours than others. The majority of carers still are women, but there's a significant amount of men caring. These are mainly daughters and spouses and partners. And as I said, a significant number of carers are age 65 plus. So it's really important to know, I think, who cares in terms of policy. And again, I think we need to spend a little bit of time on that. The why people care, and again, this is just given a sort of, when I set out to think about how I might contextualize this, it's important to think about why people care. And people care for a variety of reasons. And the first one is one that people tend to love the people they care for, and that's for many is a good enough reason to care. For the vast majority of people, there's reciprocity. When you ask people who care, this is simply reciprocal care when you look at over a life course. You know, and any of us who've been involved in personal care of a mother or a father or grandparent know that you can't help but thinking when you're involved in that care and think back about the reciprocity involved in this when they at various times of your life cared for them. Some elements of moral obligation are at play, some elements of guilt. Sometimes it's serendipity, just events happen. It turns out you're the one that cares, and maybe you didn't intend to care, but it turns out that the way the cards crumbled, you were the one that took on the responsibility. And the question of social pressure, I think that's an interesting question. It's an ill-defined question. It's less researched in Ireland than elsewhere, going back to the question of, well, what sort of society do we think about when we think of caring, and how do we think of care as providing this huge support for the Irish social care system? So these are some of the questions with the why do people care. The consequences will be described in detail in my co-presenters. So I'm not going to get into much detail here, but they're quite clearly financial. People maybe have to take early retirement, people have to engage in part-time working, there may be reduced income, there may be health effects, of course, mental and physical. Sometimes these are intertwined. If there's stress, care stress, this may feed into physical distress or depression. Quality of life may be affected. Carers may have poor choice sets. Their choices may be constrained or in some way because of the amount of caring they do. And of course, the other side, there may be really positive benefits from caring. And those, again, of us who are involved in caring, probably all the time think of a combination of those. That as well as it may be impact on quality of life if it can be positive as well, where people get satisfaction and well-being from looking after a relative. So people get utility from caring as well. It's important to remember that as we go through this discussion today as well, because much of the time we may spend thinking about how can we improve policy, but it's also, I think, useful to remember the reasons people care and the benefits people get from caring as well. Some perspectives on caring, heterogeneity. Every caring relationship is unique. And I think that's a really important point to dwell on. Every caring relationship is unique. It's not possible to talk about caring in its generality. I think the issues about personal and caring are really important about how caring relationships impact on the person with dementia. I think caring competence and confidence, that takes us into education and training and allowing people to do the job well and supporting people to do the job well. The locus of control, internal or external, really interesting questions about autonomy, but particularly in terms of what services and supports get delivered and who decides on those services and supports. There is the burden. And the burden is often relates to severity of the caring relationship in terms of the behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia in particular. The literature will tell us that. And I think changing expectations on the caring role itself. Caring 20 years ago is not the same as caring now, and caring 20 years from now is not going to be the same because society is evolving and changing continuously. So what we might have taken as normal 20 years ago is no longer normal, and similarly what's normal now and is not going to be normal in 20 years. And I think that's important for policymakers and all of us. So finally then, these issues will be taken up again as we go through our discussion, in much more detail than I can give. Longitudinal experience, caring can be short-term or long-term. There's a whole knowledge, education and training. The issue of economic and financial supports, I think, is an ongoing policy issue and should be. There is the whole psychosocial, biopsychosocial relationship and how that might be articulated through new home care legislation. There is linking and services supports to actual care needs, listening to carers, listening to people with dementia, listening to carers, looking to the integration of these needs, that one set of needs complementing the other. And I think the voice and choice for carers, and particularly I would say the role of information. Information asymmetries it's really cost effective to deal with information asymmetries between in the area of dementia. I think we're not doing enough there. We should be doing much more. And I think matching care availability in the future and the expectations of caring, the future is going to be different. I mean, that seems like obvious and it seems like hardly earth-shattering, but I think it's really important to remember that our expectations will be evolving and changing. So will policy, and so will the demands that people with dementia themselves put on the service through the articulation and listening to what they want, and also through how carers respond to those needs. So these are some of the issues that I think we might get to today, and hopefully we'll address some of them. And I thank people for listening in or for registering and also for submitting questions. And we will hopefully at the end, and certainly at the end, be able to deal with a number of those questions. And when I looked at the questions, I saw that a lot of them will be dealt with by the various speakers, and all the speakers got your questions. So hopefully we'll be able to address a lot of them during the conversation and explicitly at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'll be ready to hand over now to Suzanne, who is more than qualified to speak after a stellar career in research in the area of dementia and caring, and associated with Trinity College for so long, and also associated with ourselves here in Galway now. And we're really delighted to have Suzanne guiding us in many different areas of our work. So Suzanne, I'll hand over to you now, and I'll put myself on mute.
Thank you, Eamon. Now, okay. Can everybody see my screen? Can you hear me?
That's perfect, Suzanne. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to start, and thank you, thank the IGS, and thank Eamon and his team in Galway for inviting me to address this topic. It's a topic pretty much close to my heart, having been involved in the area for so many years now. So the title of the talk is Dementia and Family Caregivers in Ireland, an Invisible Workforce. And here's an overview of what I hope to talk about over the next 20 minutes. Eamon referred to the numbers of people in Ireland, the estimated numbers who have dementia and the cost of care. Then who are the informal caregivers or the family caregivers? And in the context of dementia, how do policymakers recognize or view informal carers? What measures are in place to support them? Who are the really vulnerable or the really at-risk informal caregivers? And are we doing enough for them? And how has COVID actually affected informal caregivers? And then finishing up with future policy directions. And this is just a recap. I'm going to skip over it because Eamon has covered the first 3 points really well, the numbers and the cost of care. And the fact that 2/3 of these people are living in the community, of whom we think probably about a quarter have a severe or an advanced dementia. And then about another third, probably up to about 8,000 people live alone who have dementia. And Eamon also referred to the major costs of dementia care being borne by informal caregivers, about 48% of the costs based on a study done some years ago. Informal care is supposedly cost effective, a way of keeping people out of nursing homes and out of hospital and respecting people's own choices to live at home. And we know from the work that Dr. Maria Pierce did some years ago that there's estimated to be about 60,000 informal caregivers to people with dementia here in Ireland. So what is informal care? Now, there's a lot of confusion about how it's conceptualized. And here I'm just using a very broad and general definition that's often used in gerontological research. It refers to any help, usually unpaid, provided by an older family member who has functional limitations, either in their ADLs or in their IADLs. So in their kind of routine tasks, their self-care that we all do and take for granted, like dressing and toileting, and then in their IADLs, the more complex tasks that require executive functioning, like say banking or grocery shopping or cooking, etc. We know it's gendered, although there are men who are very capable caregivers, but they're in the minority. Family care, informal care goes on behind closed doors, and it's often invisible to policymakers, so that it's kind of hidden, or that policymakers may not be that aware of exactly what goes on. This definition of what an informal caregiver is important, as it helps to determine access to services, and it has repercussions in terms of the supports people get. And actually, on this whole point about informal care, I had a chat with Helen Rochford-Brennan this morning, our Irish champion for dementia, really. Helen has done wonderful work in the area of advocacy. And she reminded me about, how so often people with dementia, certainly in the earlier stages of dementia, need more of a supporter than an actual caregiver, than somebody, providing personal care tasks. They need somebody to support and prop them up. And I think that's an important point. So moving on, this slide just reminds us that countries and governments around the world are committed to community care policies. Now, community care is really a bit of a misnomer because it's not care by the community, it's care in the community, and it's really care by family members, who most of whom are women. So I think that's important to remember, that it's informal care, which is really predominantly family care and care delivered mostly by women. The scale of informal caring in Europe is very large. Estimates of the numbers of carers across Europe range from 10 to 25% of the total population. And as much as 80% of all long-term care in Europe is provided by these informal caregivers. And in Ireland, we have estimates that there are between 4 to 10% of our population engaged in full-time care roles. And these figures are based on the census from 2016, the 4%, where the question wasn't that well worded. And most people actually are of the view that the 10% figure is much more realistic in terms of the numbers of people involved in informal care roles. This slide reminds us of the complexities in the term informal care and the dualisms in caregiving. And so often informal care is really about labor. It's about tending tasks that go on, both oftentimes in the context of dementia, day and night. But the actual labor of care can erode the loving aspects of care. And so often governments, I believe, hone in on the loving aspects of care, the caring about and the fluffy, warm generosity of care, ignoring the heavy physical tasks of dementia care. So if you think of somebody looking after a relative at home with dementia, having to be up during the night, maybe dealing with episodes of incontinence, the heavy physical tasks can be very, very wearing. So how do governments view informal caregivers? Well, there's great variability really in terms of, and this is a very nice, I think, model developed by Twig and Aikens in the UK, from seeing carers as resources to be used, and where families have main responsibility for care, and the state only steps in kind of crisis or in very difficult situations, to the other extreme where carers are superseded, where care is really a state responsibility and family members play a very, very subsidiary role. And then where carers are seen as co-workers or as co-clients, where the carers have a collective responsibility in formal care and formal care, balancing the two. And this type of typology can be often reflected in welfare regimes that Eamon has referred to earlier this afternoon, from Southern European models of welfare, like in countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain, and we'll be hearing about the Spanish experience later this afternoon, to the universalistic model where there is high taxation, and in the Nordic countries, the type of services can be extremely good. And then the liberal welfare states, countries like the UK, where formal services are clearly means tested, and conservative welfare regimes like in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, where social insurance actually is used to cover the costs of care, and where, say as an example in Germany, the cared for person can be given cash for care and can choose who they want to employ, whether they want, and can also get benefits in kind or in cash or both. And in the Netherlands, the personal budgets for care. So very different systems and regimes. So what's the situation in Ireland, and how does the national strategy view carers? Well, clearly based on this policy document, care of a person with dementia should be a joint responsibility. So on page 18 of the strategy, there's a statement: a combination of formal and informal supports offers the person the best opportunity to produce the optimal outcomes for the person. And people with dementia should be facilitated to remain living at home. This kind of policy commitment to community care is embedded in the strategy. And as much support as possible should be given to the informal caregiver who cares for that person. So what do people get then? What type of supports? And clearly, in my view, there's two major types of supports. There's formal support services, and then there's income support. And I'm going to go through these very, very briefly. The first two boxes in this slide shows the type of in-home services that have more recently been amalgamated: home help and home care packages and intensive home care packages, and then daycare. And it's very difficult to get figures on the numbers of people with dementia in Ireland using these types of services. We have broad figures on older people using home support services. But as I said, difficult to extrapolate from that what proportion of these people have dementia. We know, based on Tom Pearce's work in Galway quite recently, that up to about 3,000 people out of the 14,000 people who were using daycare, I think it was last year, 3,000 of these people had a dementia. So the numbers are quite small. And then on this slide, we see the other more recently evolving services for people with dementia, like cognitive rehabilitation therapy, cognitive stimulation therapy, and psychosocial educational interventions. And again, based on the evaluation of these new programs, the numbers availing of these new services were quite small, although these services were essentially being trialed. And then we have this work is being done through the National Dementia Office as part of the rolling out of the National Dementia Strategy, and extremely worthwhile. And these services have been very well evaluated. And then the Dementia Advisory Service that's recently been developed by the Alzheimer's Society, the cafes, and the assistive technology, where there's about 27 memory technology resource rooms around the country, again being used by really small numbers, but very effective services. So this really, we have the combination of the more traditional services that tended to focus on the needs of the person, of the caregiver, and then the more recent services that really have been focusing on the needs of both the person with dementia and on family caregivers. The income supports vary from the carer's allowance that's means tested to the carer's benefit that's non-means tested, and to the carer's support grant, which is a once-off annual payment for, it used to be associated with respite care, but now it can be used for any particular need, and then the home care tax credits. And the carer's benefit is underpinned by the Carers Leave Act, which entitles a person of up to 2 years' time out of work to provide full-time care. This is a nice model developed by Bettina Cass from Australia, and it just reminds us, apart from the services I've referred to, the financial supports and the services, the in-home services for users and carers, the importance of employers being on board to facilitate carers to take time out of work to care, with, say, in Ireland, the carers benefit and the carers leave. And then the importance of the policy context, the carers strategy, as is the case in Ireland, and how that actually props the employee up to juggle both caring and work roles and what's going on there. And so I'm just moving on now to just talk to a little bit about the stress of caring. And Eamon has very adequately covered this in terms of reminding us that for many people, caregiving is quite rewarding, but it can also have deleterious effects on people's mental and their physical health. And particularly with dementia, the challenging behaviors, sometimes referred to as the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, can actually be very irritating and can cause a lot of distress because they're unpredictable, and they can be embarrassing. And over time, they can accumulate to create a lot of strain for the carer and to result in decisions made to have a person who with a more advanced dementia move into a nursing home. Eamon also reminded us about the financial strain of caring, and for the younger or the middle-aged carers, sometimes their need to reduce their work hours or quit work completely or take up a less demanding job, and the financial consequences of such. So both the impact of caring in terms of its impact on physical health, mental health, and financial strain are very important. This is a book I have just recently had published on the perspectives on the person and family caregiving in Ireland in the context of dementia. And really, the book is dedicated to Manona Heron in recognition of the very hard work that women do in unpaid care jobs and in poorly paid care jobs, oftentimes as formal caregivers in Ireland. And I wrote the book because I was very keen to showcase the excellent work that's gone on over recent years too, through the National Dementia Office and through the implementation of the National Dementia Strategy. And the book really refers to how services have evolved over the years, but also what needs to be done in the future if we're going to really be able to continue to give older people with dementia the type of care that they deserve. I'm finishing up talking about the at-risk care, the particularly vulnerable caregivers. And here I'm referring to engulfed caregivers. That's a term used in the literature to describe people who allow caring completely dominate their lives to the point where all their own interests and their own health concerns are subordinated, and their whole world shrinks, and they're just completely, they have such a strong injunction to care. Older carers with chronic health problems, often when you go into a household where a person has dementia, it may be hard to distinguish the care receiver from the caregiver, from the informal caregiver, because it can well be the case that the family caregiver it looks more frail and actually has accumulated more age-related chronic health problems than the person that is being cared for who has dementia. Caregivers with multiple care roles. Here I'm referring to, say, women in the middle, caught between generations, who may be caring for children, as well as a parent with a dementia, as well as perhaps a parent-in-law. And then those carers reluctant to ask for support or to talk. And I've seen this time over time in my own research, the carers who say, as a parent, they don't want to burden their children and have their adult, say, daughter know the extent of care dad needs, that dad's incontinent at night, or that dad gets very aggressive, or dad has delusions, trying to protect a parent from an adult child. And these are carers, I think, who are particularly at risk, and who, in the typology I referred to earlier on, should be looked upon as co-clients as opposed to resources. The effects of COVID, just very briefly, it's increased informal care provision due to unemployment, furloughed workers, more flexible work arrangements. We have very nice work produced by the Alzheimer's Society, looking at the impact of COVID last year, where in their research, they showed that people were more lonely, both family caregivers and the person at home with dementia. They suffered, they felt socially isolated, they had fears, their anxiety levels increased, and that by virtue of being unable to get out, people with dementia, their challenging behaviors became more accentuated, and they were bored and they lacked the routine of their normal lives. And the other point on this slide is that the pandemic may result in an even greater desire on the part of informal caregivers to keep their relatives at home because of the bad press that's associated with nursing homes now. Another paper recently published in the BMJ, written by a group of researchers from the UK, again pointing to the adverse effects COVID has had on the mental well-being of people with dementia. The work is a longitudinal study done over a 3-month period with interviews, data collected through telephone interviews. So are we doing enough to support informal caregivers or family caregivers in Ireland? Well, here's my view. We have a very low use of formal support services where a person has dementia. And again, it's difficult to know, but I suspect up to about a third of family caregivers using formal services are also buying in private services. And what that suggests needs to be kind of unraveled. That's based on the evaluation work of the intensive home care packages done a couple of years ago. There's a very low take up of the carers benefit. That's the benefit associated with the carers leave. In 2018, I did some work for the EU, and as few as 1.3% of all carers were availing of the carers benefit. And we have to question what's going on there. There's an incongruence in government policy that favours community care, purports to support community care, but our funding is disproportionately channeled towards residential care. Alternatives to nursing homes in Ireland are extremely limited, but preliminary scoping work done by Eamon O'Shea and his group really has produced findings that I believe need to be acted on quite immediately in terms of are being able to offer people other options rather than just care at home or care in home. So here referring to sheltered housing and housing with care and different models of long-term care. Recommendations for statutory home support scheme that Eamon has referred to were embedded in the Sláinte report, and they've been set out in the programme for government. There was piloting of that scheme expected to commence last year, and again that was delayed because of COVID, and I believe it's now getting underway this year, but very important. And so I just want to finish up by talking about the fact that, and Eamon again has alluded to this, that in the future, informal care will become even more important due to changing demographics, population aging, greater prevalence of dementia, advances in healthcare, and the changes COVID is likely to bring about to family members' obligations to care. But with more women, and Irish women we know, entering the paid labour market, can we rely on this reserve army of labour? And we need to be thinking about caregiving, the continuum of care, removing the boundaries between community and residential and formal and informal, paid and unpaid, public and private. We need to be developing partnerships in care, combining good medical and clinical care with good psychosocial care. And really developing integrated care pathways, which is the work that the NDO is currently doing, rolling out the dementia strategy. We know that policy reform is already underway in terms of the statutory home care support scheme. So there are opportunities now to really make Ireland one of the best countries in Europe to live well with dementia. But family caregivers must be given appropriate supports and have predictable access to services. Informal carers are the cornerstone, the linchpin to the success of community care policies. But informal care is not cost-free, and there's direct and indirect costs that we've referred to, both for the individual and the state. And so what do informal carers want? And are we doing enough to support this invisible workforce? And I'm going to stop there. That sets the scene, I think, for our next speaker. So thank you for listening to me. Hello.
That's great, Suzanne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. And
okay.
Yeah, we'll quickly move on to our next speaker, who's Anya Thehan. Anya is, I think she just finished her PhD here. Well, I know she's just finished her PhD because I'm a supervisor. And she has a body of work behind her in relation to care. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Anya.
Great, thanks very much, Eamon. I'll just share my slides here. Yeah, thanks a million for the introduction there, Eamon. My name is Anya Thehan, and I'm a PhD student in the CSRD based in NUI Galway. So a lot of the research that I've done over the last 4 years has looked at what family carers' preferences for services and supports are, and also what public attitudes are towards these increased provision of these supports. So Suzanne and Eamon gave a really good overview there of the caring landscape in Ireland, of the increasing pressures that are on family carers in future, and also of the increasing demand that we will see in the next few years relating to increased prevalence of dementia, but also the move towards aging in place and community-based care in Ireland. So my research is going to focus on so today I'll be presenting on two key research questions. So the first is looking at identifying family care preferences for supports and services to help address some of the challenges that they experience associated with caring for a person with dementia. And then following on from that, given that any increased provision of services for family carers would likely be funded through general taxation, I'm also going to look a bit at public attitudes towards increased provision of care for family carers, and kind of try and get some insights into what the public think about family caring in Ireland. So I'll be presenting findings on two related research projects that we've carried out here in the CESRD. So our first project will be identifying families' carers' preferences, and this was carried out using nominal group technique focus groups. And then a bit later on, I'll talk more about identifying the public's preferences for increased provision of family care supports. So yeah, so we carried out 3 focus groups with family carers of people, with 17 family carers of people with dementia. And these focus groups were carried out in Kerry, Galway and Dublin. The family carers who took part in the focus groups came from a mix of backgrounds. So we had a mix of spousal, adult, child, former and current family carers of people with dementia at different stages. And this was really important for us, as we know that carers aren't a heterogeneous group, that there are differences in the challenges that carers experience. In the focus groups, we use an adapted nominal group technique approach to identify challenges and service preferences that family carers have. And nominal group technique is a kind of structured consensus approach that's used in focus groups, which allows all of the participants to have an opportunity to give their opinions on services in Ireland. So our focus groups took place, 6 steps were involved in focus groups. During the first step, family carers discussed challenges that they themselves had experienced. In step 2, family carers were given a list of pre-existing services that were available for family carers of people with dementia, either nationally or internationally, but not all of the services were available in Ireland. In step 3, family carers had the opportunity to identify new services that they'd like to be added to this list. And then in step 4, ourselves, the facilitators, and the other family carers in the group asked for clarification around these new services that were suggested by other family carers. Then in step 5, family carers ranked these services according to the value that they felt each service offered to family carers of people with dementia. So we then compiled these individual rankings and came up with a group ranking, and we presented the group for consensus to make sure that these rankings reflected the preferences of the family carers who took part in focus groups. So we carried out this process was repeated twice. In the first time, each of the steps related to the individual challenges experienced by family carers of people with dementia. And this really related to day-to-day challenges associated with caring, their relationship with the person with dementia, and also relationships with families and friends. And then the second time we carried out this process, each of the steps were related to the wider social disadvantages associated with caring for a person with dementia. And I suppose discussion in these areas really focused around the organisation of health and social care services, the social welfare system in Ireland, and also cultural expectations around care. And it was really important that we got families' care preferences under both these headings to reflect that the disadvantages experienced by carers of people with dementia exist on an individual and a wider social level. So to give you an idea of the breadth of services that family carers were asked to consider, Under the individual heading, family carers considered 16 supports aimed at addressing some of the challenges that they experience on a day-to-day basis. And then within the wider, under the wider social heading, family carers considered 14 services. And the services in bold, or the services or supports in bold here, are services that family carers suggested be added to our pre-existing list. So once we had finalized these lists and focus groups, family carers then ranked each of these services according to the value that they felt offered to family carers. And so under our individual heading, then we would have compiled all of these individual rankings across the focus groups and identified the top 5 priorities according to family carers in our focus groups. So under the individual heading, daycare, carers support group, short break respite, long break respite, and social activities were seen as particularly valuable. And from family carers' perspectives, daycare, short break respite, and long break respite were very important in addressing their need to take a break from caring. Carers support group was seen as a source of emotional support and having the opportunity to talk to other people in a similar position as them. And then social activities from carers' perspectives were discussed in relation to relationship changes with the person with dementia, particularly if kind of shared hobbies and interests that the carer and person with dementia had previously were no longer accessible. They were looking for replacement social activities. Under the wider social heading, family carers identified a universal carers allowance as a top priority. So currently in Ireland, the carers allowance is means tested, but the top priority was a universal carers allowance. Legal recognition of the carers role, carers support grant, which is an annual payment of €1,850 made to family carers in Ireland, a monthly wage, and then community awareness. And from family carers' perspectives, carers allowance, the carers support grant, and the monthly wage would go some way towards addressing some of the financial challenges that they experienced, particularly if they had given up work. And also they highlighted a lot of the out-of-pocket costs associated with caring for a person with dementia, particularly, as Suzanne mentioned, in relation to paying for replacement care. Legal recognition was seen by carers as a way of developing a set of rights and entitlements, and also increasing their status in society, as they felt that since becoming a family carer, they were less recognised on a societal level. And community awareness programs were seen as a way to address the stigma that was associated with dementia and increase public understanding around dementia, but also around family caring in Ireland. So really these approaches and the findings of the focus groups kind of suggest that any policy approaches that would facilitate more breaks for carers or financial supports would be hugely valued. And I think that these findings are very policy accessible and provide quite a clear prioritization of family care preferences for services. So building on these findings, the next stage of the research looks at public preferences and attitudes towards increased provision of services to family carers in Ireland. And to investigate these public preferences, we carried out a discrete choice experiment, or a DCE survey. So a DCE is a type of specialized survey which looks at surveys respondents' preferences for hypothetical scenarios of service provision. So in our context, we asked members of the general public to make decisions between hypothetical support packages aimed at family carers of people with dementia. So this survey was completed by a nationally representative sample of 509 members of the general public, and it was conducted between January and March of this year. So it's really important to try and get an idea of how the public views family carers, because like I said earlier, it's likely that any increased provision is going to be funded through general taxation. So introducing kind of budgetary constraints by asking members of the public if they'd be willing to pay additional taxation is a good way to get insight into how the public thinks about family care. But I would like to mention here as well that one of the limitations of DCEs is that they deal with hypotheticals. So in a real life scenario, we might not get the same results, but at the same time, they are still quite a good indication of public preferences. So translating the preferences that family carers identified in the focus groups into a solid survey design required a few additional steps. And I suppose the first step was identifying attributes and levels. So in this context, an attribute refers to the support or service, and the level refers to the level of delivery of this support or attribute. So our final list of attributes included daycare, which could be delivered 1 day a week, 2 days a week, or not be available. Long break respite, which would be delivered for 2 weeks every year, and it could be either 2 weeks per year, and it could be either delivered in the home of the person with dementia, or out of home in a community hospital or a nursing home, or it could be not available at all. Carers support groups could be available once a month or not available, and then carers allowance could be means tested, universally available or not available at all. And then we also included an additional taxation attribute, which allowed us to put a monetary value on the preferences identified. And the levels here range from 0 to 400 euros. So this was an iterative process. We involved family carers and dementia-specific service providers. We consulted with them throughout the survey design process and carried out 10 pre-pilot interviews with members of the general public, as well as a pilot with 50 members of the general public to make sure that the survey was understandable. And so once we had finalized, and I suppose you'll notice here as well that not all of the services identified by the focus groups are included here. And that's really because we couldn't include 2 attributes or supports that offered overlapping benefits. So for example, we couldn't include carers allowance and a monthly wage. And also this is quite a complex survey to fill out. So it was really important that we didn't include too many supports and attributes, which would kind of overburden the survey respondents. Once we finalized our list of attributes and levels, we then developed choice cards. And this is an example of a choice card here. So survey respondents completed 12 choice cards, and this allowed us to identify their preferences between each service. Each choice card contained 3 hypothetical scenarios. So you'll see here in package 1, daycare would be available for 2 days a week, long break respite would be available for 2 weeks but delivered in home, care peer support groups would be available once a month, and carers allowance will be universally available. And this package will come at an additional cost of 200 euros to survey respondents every year. In contrast, package 2 only had 1 day of daycare available a week and will come at an additional taxation of 50 euro per year. And then package 3. So package 3 reflects current provision in Ireland. So while daycare, long break respite and care peer support groups are available, they're not available to the majority of family carers. So most family carers don't have access to these services. So for our current provision, we set this level to not available for these services or attributes, and then carers allowance was means tested, which is the national provision in Ireland. So the levels in package 1 and 2 varied from each choice card, but then current provision in package 3 stayed the same throughout each of the choice cards. And we also asked some additional questions relating to the survey respondents' beliefs around the financial responsibility for care of people with dementia in Ireland. So 3% of our sample believe that the person with dementia should be financially responsible for their own care. 13% believe that family members should be financially responsible for the care of relatives with dementia. But the vast majority of our sample believe that the Irish state should have main financial responsibility for the care of people with dementia in Ireland. And I suppose just looking at the Irish state cohort, We asked a few additional questions to get an idea of whether they thought that family carers and people with dementia should make any financial contribution towards their care. And we found that just 34% of this cohort believed that only the state should have full financial responsibility for the provision of care to people with dementia. Just under 15% believe that the person with dementia should have to make some financial contributions. 32% believe that the family members should have to make some financial contributions, and then around 19% thought that both the person with dementia and their family should have to make some financial contribution, in addition to the state having the main responsibility of care. So moving on to the analysis of the public preferences. So we analysed the DCE data using a mixed logic in the willingness to pay space. I've included the figures here for any econometricians or DCE enthusiasts in the audience. So really what our findings, so all of our attributes came back as statistically significant, which shows that when survey respondents were making their decisions between the hypothetical service packages, all of the attributes or supports included in that package impacted on people's decision making. In terms of preferences, more generally, it seemed, in terms of preferences for these supports, we found that, so we included a tax attribute, and this allowed us to put a monetary value on people's preferences. So we found very strong preferences for daycare. Survey respondents were willing to pay €338 in additional tax per year for family carers to receive 1 day of daycare per week. Survey respondents were willing to pay €448 for family carers of people with dementia to receive 2 days of daycare per week. The preferences in relation to in-home and out-of-home respite were quite similar, with our survey respondents be willing to pay €294 and €299 respectively for long break respite to be provided to carers. Our survey respondents were willing to pay €116 in additional taxation to have care support groups provided to family carers of people with dementia. And then in relation to extending carers allowance from its current mean testing status to a universal provision, survey respondents were willing to pay just under €175 per year. However, I suppose when you look at carers allowance, there was a really strong negative preference for removing carers allowance completely, or not providing any level of carers allowance to people, and you'd actually have to pay the survey respondents €320 a year for them to support abolishing carers allowance overall. So really what our findings are showing here is that there is actually a mismatch between what the public are willing to support and the current funding allocation towards services aimed at family carers of people with dementia in Ireland. So in relation to our findings, the survey respondents would support increased investment in services directly aimed at family carers of people with dementia. From the focus group's findings, we found that family carers identified a range of challenges associated with caring, but they also had very clear views on the supports and services that they would like to see prioritized to meet these challenges that they experience on an individual and wider social level. Also, from the focus group's findings, it's really important to mention the family carers did emphasize that there needed to be dual benefit offered by some of the services, particularly daycare and long break respite, that in order for family carers to access and use these services, they would like there to be a benefit for the person with dementia as well. So that's really important in terms of future planning. And really, so I suppose looking at the policy implications of our findings and looking at what Suzanne and Eamon have presented on, I suppose one of the biggest implications is that current policy in Ireland, or support systems in Ireland, need to be specified to support family carers of people with dementia on an individual and wider social level. So at the moment, family carers are nearly overlooked in policy. But really, when you look at family carers as a cohort in their own right from a population health perspective, they experience a number of disadvantages associated with caring in relation to their mental, physical, and financial well-being. And then from an economic perspective, they make a massive contribution towards the long-term care system for people with dementia in Ireland. And they're only going to become more essential in this long-term care system as time goes on. So really, it's very important at the moment to start developing strong support systems based on their preferences that are also supported by the public. And I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who took part in this study, and and everyone who contributed in every way. So thanks very much.
Okay, Anya, thank you very much. Really interesting results in the context of the public's willingness to support carers there, and I think those results are really interesting. So the final speaker for today is Manuel Ruiz-Adame, who I met when he came to Galway on sabbatical, and we had a good few discussions on informal care. And before COVID struck, we were going to do a piece of work together, but I was interested in a Spanish perspective a little bit on what the things we were going to talk about today. So over to you, Manuel, and welcome to the webinar.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the IGS and to the Center for Economic and Social Research on Dementia, and very especially to Professor Imon Oche for inviting me. What I'm going to speak about today as a spontan is about making a small comparison between the Irish and the Spanish model of care, and to link it with some of the studies as I have done about the socioeconomic profile, preferences about caring, and social costs of dementia, basically in the south of Spain, that this is where I mainly work. I would like to start by telling you something about myself that I think it could be helpful. When I wake up, the first things I do in the mornings is go to my bathroom, I look in the mirror, and this is who I see. This is me, or at least this is how I see myself. I see someone who is handsome, who is successful, an attractive gay, yes. The problem is what you see is the other gay, the one on the right. What do I mean with this? What I mean is that most of the time, the people who organize the social and health systems, the policymakers, have certain ideas about what they do that don't always match with those that other stakeholders have. In this last presentation, I would like to give an answer to these questions. Is a person-centered strategy possible? What do caregivers or people with dementia want? Is the current model of care sustainable? Well, what do we have? Dementia is a syndrome that includes impairment at different levels. If we imagine dementia as a dashboard, the center, the main focus, we agree that it is the cognitive impairment, but in a biomedical model, we must include others such as behavioral, psychiatric, and mood disorders. The size of each area can change depending on other factors. Among these factors, we can generalize and highlight two main contextual factors. One is about the general health situation and the stage of the syndrome. And the second is about the social support and integration that includes participation in activities and personal decisions. Well, in a recent study by Susan Cahill, she showed us how the focus on the approach to the illness can shift from a biomedical model based on the reduction of the cognitive, behavioral, and psychiatric symptoms to a more based on human rights and active participation of the person with dementia model, a personhood model. So now the question is it possible to apply a person strategy, a personhood model to the reality? Well, the Irish National Dementia Strategy identifies two main overarching principles. One is personhood and the other is citizenship. It means that the general idea is going through a paradigm shift to a person-centered caring model. In a Nick Henley and Imon Oche paper, they found that most of the stakeholders wanted a new approach to take hold, as they saw in the answers in the questionnaire they submitted to different organizations and individuals involved in dementia services. In Spain's case, we have a national dementia plan that covers a period, the current dementia plan, from 2019 to 2023. This plan is designed with the intention to improve the situation of the people with dementia and to involve all the stakeholders that have to do with these issues. But there are 2 points to consider. And the first one is that responsibilities about the health and social systems depends on the regional governments, and we have 17 regional governments. And the second is that this plan doesn't have a specific budget, and it's quite difficult to apply a plan without a budget. Another question is about the quality of life among people with dementia and the caregivers. Well, what improves the quality of life among people with dementia and the caregivers? Well, it's not an easy question to answer, as Professor Emma O'Shea and other authors have shown. It depends on the stage, who you ask, the person with dementia or the caregiver, the level of preservation of the cognitive dimensions, functional abilities, and other variables such as the education level or sociodemographic characteristics, among others. Basically, these are the 3 main areas or levels that we can identify as biological, individual, and sociological, described by Neve Henley and Imo Oche in other of the last papers. What do we have in Spain? Well, reading one of the papers of Onya Tihan and other authors, they found a very similar profile with certain characteristics in Ireland to the one I found in Spain. In both countries, it's based on family carers, but in fact, this is a common characteristic across all Europe and in many other countries. Spain is a country with about 47 million people. 10.8 million of them are over 65 years old. And in the area in which I mainly work, the south of Spain, Andalusia, there are about 8.7 million people. 1.7 million of them are over 65 years old. If we consider a prevalence figure of 6.5% of the people over 65, the estimated number of people with dementia are, as you can see in the slide, is a huge number. Since 2006, we have new rights in Spain. They allow us to receive care and support when you are in a dependency situation, not only in the case of dementia, in any dependency situation. It means that the government has to provide services and facilities such as this one, economic support for dependents and caregivers, economic support to pay for a personal service, daycare centers, night care centers, nursing homes, and telecare services, among others. To know if the services fit to the population they are designed for, we should know this population. And that's what we did in this paper published at the Scandinavian Journal of Caring Science. And what did we see? I'm only going to highlight some of the main characteristics. Well, the general profile is that of a woman with an age of 57 years old, more or less, who doesn't work outside the home, with a basic level of education, and who live with the person with dementia. What I see more important is the profile of the younger caregivers, the one on the right column. Those that we define as people under 40s. In this case, they were also women, but the educational level was higher. More of them work outside the home, and in a higher proportion, they do not live with the person with dementia. The profile of the new generation is clearly different from the traditional. An additional point is to value the contribution of these caregivers in terms of cost. If we see it in terms of direct costs, measures in the case of family as payment out of pockets, we can get to the conclusion that family contributions are obviously higher, but in a certain way, both parts, the state and the families, are not so different in proportion. These costs obviously increase with the severity, with the level of education of the caregiver, in our case, with the labor situation. It's higher among those who are in an employed situation than in the other situation possible. It's higher for men because they used to look for external services in a higher proportion. It's higher for those caregivers who don't live with the people with dementia, in general. And there are no differences between the public expenditure and the private expenditures. If we compare with the case of Ireland, if we do a small review of the Ireland case, we find similar results. Some of them have been mentioned at the beginning. Connolly stated that the total annual cost of dementia care in Ireland was estimated to be about 1.9 billion, and an important percentage of this, 48% of this cost, provided by informal caregivers, basically by families. In the same line, Kelly said that most of the expenses due to caring is assumed by family caregivers. Again, in an important proportion, 32% of annual household income are direct costs, out-of-pocket care-related expenses. In short, as Onja Tihan stated, family caregivers provide the care that the state will have to fund at a higher cost to the citizen. When we see it in terms of indirect costs, for the case of Spain, if we evaluate the contribution of the informal caregivers in this scenario, indirect cost, we see that depending on the method used to measure it, it can be between 1.15% and over 2.57% of the national GDP for the case of Spain. Obviously, these figures are quite difficult to be assumed by any country. A question at this moment is, do caregivers look for external services? Well, since we have the right to provide support in the case of dependency, the truth is that most carers look for external support services. And the proportion is higher if the educational level is higher too. In terms of number of hours, they basically prefer low or medium intensive services. Basically, those are the services that are provided by rehabilitation programs and daycare centers that are between 4 and 8 hours a day. Only the probability to choose for services such as nursing homes increase among those of higher educational level and income level too. Measured by a logistical model, the probability to use external services depends on these variables: working situation, cohabitation, caregiver age, and educational level. Obviously, as you can see, the probability is higher among those who are in an active working situation, among those who don't live with the person with dementia, among younger caregivers, and when the educational level is higher, and obviously with the income level is higher too. To conclude, there is a tendency to look for external support services. And when we have the right to use it, we use it. The use of these services increase. The preferences are mainly for low or medium intensive services, because this kind of services provided by the government or privately improve the integration of the person with dementia in the usual or the natural environment, the social and family life. The traditional profile of caregiver is changing, and we can see it when we analyze the younger profile. And there are certain variables that are important to be considered, like the working situation, the cohabitation or no among people with dementia and caregivers, and education and income levels determine preferences for more intensive support services. So to answer the 3 questions I asked at the beginning, well, I would say that to start, is a person-centered strategy possible? Well, the external support services are still designed under a biomedical model. It's not possible to know the preferences of the people with dementia if their willingness are ignored. In the case of Spain, we have a document that I could translate like a anticipated willingness document that you can fulfill in a notary, in which you express your preferences in the possible case in the future that you are going to be in a dependency situation. And this is a guide for the health services and for the family too, but this is not a mandatory document to follow. About the second question, caregivers want to use services that allow them to keep on with their normal life as much as possible in their usual environment. And the last question is the current model of care sustainable? I think that maybe it's the most important question. The current model of care is an unbalanced model. It's still very dependent on the informal carers, and mainly gender imbalance, because it's basically based on the traditional role of women at the families. So the personhood model is our desired model, the model we all want. Policymakers want to say that they are applying it, but reality is never as perfect. We are not there yet, at least in Spain's case. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Manuel. And yeah, really good to have some insights on what's happening in Spain. We have some minutes for discussion. So if everybody comes back on screen, I think I have, I hope I have maybe 10 minutes for discussion. Is that right, Roseanne? Yeah.
Yes, Eamon, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So I might just ask Suzanne, and everybody can come in on this, Manuel and Anya, but just as Suzanne, she referenced the Twig and Atkin model, and we got a lot of questions, so we won't be able to answer every question, but I was just struck by the typology and how should, particularly the question of how should Irish policymakers view family caregivers, because in the short period, I think I want to focus on policy, but so are there some lessons from that framework?
Thanks, Eamon. Yeah, I think that policymakers, and these are my views, and other people may disagree with me, but I really do think carers feel oftentimes forgotten and neglected, and policymakers tend to view them, again, in my view, as resources, and that the key responsibility, and it's linked to what you talked about earlier, the Anglo-Saxon model and the Catholic Church and the state only intervening in family matters when it's really vital. And so, yeah, the family really take the main responsibility. And I think we need to be moving more in the direction of seeing family caregivers as co-producers of care, as co-clients, as people who often have needs of their own. I mean, if you think of the English situation where there's a Carers Act and carers are entitled to a needs analysis and services in their own right. So I think that our service system is changing and we're moving more towards services, formal and informal caregivers working together. But I think it needs to be kind of progressed further. And so they're my views. And I think that typology is very helpful.
And just in the relationship to maybe Anya, the conflict between, say, the person with dementia and family carers, or that kind of duality, if you like, how to balance that in terms of policy making and in terms of service provision and preference making, if you like. Did any of that come up in the work?
Yeah, so that's kind of very interesting, looking at the conflicting preferences of family carers and people with dementia. I suppose I touched on that a small bit at the end of my presentation. On a policy level, I think developing supports and services so they have that are going to be used by both the person with dementia and the family carer. In an ideal scenario, they will be developed so that there's a dual benefit there for both partners of the care dyad. So if you're taking long break respite, for example, although these benefits are going to be made, although the benefits are aimed at family carers can't really access these benefits unless the person with dementia is also benefiting from using the service. And I think it's kind of really important to look at the family care and the person with dementia as a partnership. So if you're creating benefits for one partner, you're nearly creating benefits for the partnership overall. Like, while there might be conflicting opinions like there are with any partnership, I suppose it's really important to identify a compromise or develop services at the policy level that would have a dual benefit for both parties. But that's...
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I mean some of the work on home care packages, for example, that we looked at in another piece of work show the continued importance of family care, even when you have significant home care packages. And I don't think we should. There's an interesting substitutability complementarity question here, because sometimes people think that you can substitute maybe formal care for informal care, and it doesn't actually work like that in that kind of simple way that there's a pure substitution effect, because families may want to care, families may still have to care. It's particularly at people who the alternative might be residential care or acute care. So it's really, I think, important to keep that relationship to the fore, or the duality of those needs in terms of resource allocation. When we talk about, placement, I don't know if that makes sense to anybody.
Well, yeah, if you look at kind of the Nordic countries and like the model of care that they have up there, they actually have the highest levels of family care across Europe. But they also have such high levels of support that the family caring isn't as intensive. So maybe they're able to address areas of care that can't be offered by family services, like linking back to what you were saying about caring for love. But then they have formal services kind of substituting in and reducing the burden that they feel.
Very good. There's a COVID is probably an interesting perspective as well. And Manuel, and both our countries have been affected by COVID-19 in terms of mortality and so on. But do you think that the COVID experience will change anything about prioritization with respect to family care? And I'll open this to everybody here in terms of, say, and you referenced it, Suzanne, as well, briefly in your presentation about the perception of nursing home care relative to home care. Do you think that priorities may change directly as a result of what's happened in the past year in terms of placement and in terms of the role of home care versus residential care?
Well, in my experience in Spain, family tries to avoid institutions, even those that provide medium or low intensive services. But the truth is that, at least in Spain, families are getting smaller. The number of children per couple are about 1.17, more or less. It means that in the future, it would not be possible to keep on receiving care from families as in a traditional model has been the rule. Maybe we have to think in other models of institutions because they are going to be needed.
I think, Eamon, COVID may mean that people will want to hold on to keeping their relatives at home for a lot longer. I also think that it may have an indirect impact on employers. And now we have kind of this trend of people working from home and people remotely working. And I think that may assist the carer who's trying to juggle work and care roles in the future too.
Interesting, yeah. I think there certainly will be impacts there, which leads us to my final point. I think I'm just conscious of time, but it's a related point about, do you think, how do we ensure that we don't think about the future in the same way as the present, which is a very difficult thing in all our lives, that there's changing demographics, there's changing cultural contexts, there's, the impact of unforeseen events like COVID-19. There is the ongoing changing home care, new home care legislation coming on board. There is the increasing emphasis on spending money to keep people at home. How do we encourage policymakers to, I suppose, to think differently about the future and to anticipate the future maybe in a different way, particularly when it comes to family care? It's a hard question. It's an impossible question in 2 minutes, but any insight or anything strike you in any way about policy, about that question?
I think we need to listen carefully to what carers are saying. I think we need to look very carefully at people's motivation to care. And if people are caring reluctantly, unwillingly, that has repercussions for the quality of care being delivered. So I think that we can't assume that in the future women will continue to be available to care. So I think we need to be developing creative policies and planning carefully for the future. Manuel, with more input from state services.
Sorry, yeah. Manuel, anything from your point of view about the future in Spain in terms of, is this on the political agenda? Is this on the radar? Is this part of discourse?
Well, as I have mentioned in my presentation, the current model of care is an unbalanced model, but the costs of care are huge. I think it's not affordable for any government to assume a complete substitution of informal caregivers by professional care. Maybe the model should have to evolve. First, increasing the cognitive rehabilitation programs for mild and moderate stages, improving the options of the people with dementia to keep on being independent for a longer period. Secondly, with more daycare centers for those in mild stages. And thirdly, but not last, policymakers should consider to include or to improve tax advantages and other benefits for caregivers, because it's not possible to avoid their contribution.
And just finally then, I mean, interesting, your work has shown, I mean, we're surprised at some of these results in one sense that the public showed a willingness when confronted with different choices to spend their hard-earned money through additional taxation in different ways. Did that?
Yeah, I was very surprised at the amount of additional taxation that the survey respondents were willing to pay for family carers to receive these supports. And like, it's very interesting because I think it does show a kind of disconnect between what it is that the public want and how family carers are being supported in Ireland. So I think you mentioned in your presentation that family carers often receive a lot of lip service, like we think that they're fantastic. The contributions that they make are acknowledged, but only to the extent that they don't have to be paid for them really, or that they don't receive these benefits in terms of services and income provisions. So yeah, so it's not controversial that these services and supports aren't being provided to carers because the public does support it. Like the issue does seem to just be at the policy level. And like, I suppose looking into the future in terms of the pressures that are going to be on the family care system from aging in place policies, community-based care, and the smaller families, like it really just increased support systems need to be developed now and funded, and resources need to be allocated towards them as well.
Okay, well, I think I just got one interesting comment from somebody listening saying that referenced the duality here, that early diagnosis is so essential for both carer and person with dementia to really prepare for the journey of dementia. I think that's a really important point in the context of duality that we just got on the chat. So look, I'm just conscious of time. Just want to thank all our panelists, our three panelists, for fantastic presentation and engagement, long-term engagement, long-term engagement in the area of family carers and so on. So thank you all very much for today. Just before I hand over to Roseanne, just to thank Roseanne herself and Diarmaid O'Shea and the Irish Gerontological Society for collaborating with us here, both the Irish Centre for Social Gerontology and my own centre on dementia, for really allowing us to discuss our work in a wider context. So it's really been very, very, very interesting for us here. So thank you for that opportunity. And to Miriam and May for facilitating this as well from your end. So really thank you very much for that collaboration. So I'll hand over to Roseanne to close the event down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I'm going to echo Eamon's thanks, particularly to, in the first instance, NUIG, the two centres in NUIG with whom we've had some fantastic sessions, webinars in the context of marginalising ageing and inclusive systems. This is an opportunity for me to take a moment to publicly acknowledge the long-standing, cutting-edge policy and practice relevant research that Eamon O'Shea has contributed and his group have contributed to this area. Not only contributed, but very much led on in this area. And were we in an auditorium now, there would be a ridiculously loud round of applause to that statement, Eamon. You championed this in Ireland for so many years, and today is an exemplar of that. How the state supports ways of enabling this has been a long-standing contribution of yours to the literature. And I was very much struck, particularly by all three presentations, excellent presentations with respect to carers, and the differences cross-nationally with respect to carers. But you know, not an awful lot has changed. That's the fact of the matter. Despite all of the evidence and the different avenues that have been used to touch on policy, and we really need to exercise how we can make a difference now in the forthcoming years, because we don't have an awful lot of time to do this. There is an initiative at the moment to focus on aging in place, which to some extent reflects on your comment, Anya, and the Danish model of aging in place. And despite having over 1.5 million more population, only they have, by comparison of those in nursing homes, 90% less in nursing homes than we have, or lower numbers in nursing homes than we have. So a big difference there, but they provide support, lots of formal support. So that comes back to encouraging aging in place, but enabling aging in place. And my fear of this discussion around aging in place, that it will become in Ireland staying in place without the necessary supports to enable carers, particularly, to facilitate an individual to age in place if that is their wish. So I think we have a lot of work to do as a society, and both a gerontological society and an Irish society as a whole, and a European society. And I don't know if you have had an opportunity to respond to the green paper, which is circulated. I would please encourage everybody to do that. EU Commission green paper on transforming aging in Europe, virtually nothing with respect to recommendations in this area, despite a SAPIA report last year, which made a lot of recommendations with respect to aging in place, but the necessity for proper formal care support for aging in place. So thank you to everybody. I thank you, Manuel Ruiz-Adame Rina. I don't know if I got that right.
Don't worry.
Because you're not that much similarity. And thank you.
Don't worry.
I very, very much enjoyed it. I know Suzanne's work well, and thank you, Suzanne, again for contributing. You've also had a very long-standing contribution to the research agenda in this particular area. So thank you for that and your leadership in that context. And Anya, your wonderful work on carers and the cost and the acceptance of cost. And I think this is something, your work particularly, that policymakers need to hear, because I think there's a great lack of awareness out there. So maybe we can do like we did with vitamin D and get an Oireachtas health report. I'm not joking, health committee report to champion this on our behalf. So I'll close by thanking you all very much, and thank you, of course, to May and Miriam and to Diarmuid O'Shea, who's championed these collaborative meetings. Have a good day. Slán agus beannacht.
Thanks, Eamon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Anya.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.